Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dream Leapers. I'm your host, Harriette Cole, and this is a very special moment for our time. And a lot of people are being very reflective right now because we lost a giant, and we're in the thick of Black History Month. As we are continuing to honor legends, traditions, and our culture as a whole, we wanted to take this time to acknowledge a major loss for our community, for the world, really. Earlier this week, we learned of the passing of Reverend Jesse Jackson. And in light of this news, today we're joined by someone who knew him very well. He's a media visionary whose career spans culture, politics, public media, and storytelling. He is Eric Easter. Eric's influence in cultural media extends back decades. He served as press secretary to Reverend Jesse Jackson during both of his presidential campaigns, as well as a media strategist for campaigns including Howard Dean, Mark Warner, and Governor Doug Wilder. With Reverend Jackson's recent passing, Eric's perspective carries particular resonance, not only reflecting on a pivotal era of political activism, but also on the enduring power of voice, narrative, and movement building. Eric is a producer, writer, and media executive who currently serves as CEO of Black Box Digital Studios, creating multi-platform nonfiction content that uplifts voices and expands access to powerful narratives. He is the former CEO of Black Heritage Network and a chairman of WHUT TV at Howard University. He's also a best-selling author and creative producer behind landmark projects such as Songs of My People and HBO's Americanos. He created the digital platform at Ebony, that was ebonyjet.com, now ebony.com, and he is one of my oldest and dearest friends. Please join me in welcoming Eric Easter.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you for making the time. I know we had talked a few weeks ago when Reverend Jackson was failing, and I know you were very close to him for a really, really long time.
Right.
So,
can I make a quick correction?
Yes.
You mentioned me being press secretary for the two campaigns. I was press secretary after the two campaigns. I was a press aide for the two campaigns. I became press secretary right after the second campaign, sort of during the convention, and then for a couple of years afterwards. So just wanted to clarify.
Did you?
No. Yeah, exactly. But it's just part of the acknowledgement that there's so many people who are part of it. I mean, I hesitated to even do this just because I just want to acknowledge that there were just so very many people who were part of just a global network of folks who were blessed to work with him. I'm just sort of a small cog in that wheel. Blessed to have it, and happy to talk to you about it.
And I mean, you brought me in the '84 campaign. I don't know. I was volunteering in that office. Florence Tate was who was
Florence Tate was exactly. Yeah.
Was running the press office then. So I do know that, sometimes history gets mixed up in your head a little bit. But I remember that because it was right after graduating from Howard. And
it's my first job out of school. Yeah.
Right. And he was running for president. And it was like, Jesse Jackson is running for president. It was kind of unbelievable and real at the same time. What do you remember about that time?
So, it was interesting. You remember very well at Howard University, we had the Howard Inn, which was on campus for those who don't know. And it was the regular Friday night hang of both students and the Congressional Black Caucus. I mean, there was no other Black hotel in the city at the time. And on those Fridays, you could go have a beer, some free chicken wings and something. And then, most of the CBC, and this is before they sort of started making the habit of going back to their districts on the weekend. On Friday nights, they would be hanging at the people you studied, from John Lewis to Mickey Leland, all those folks would be at the bar talking to students, just chatting them up. And I remember vividly having a conversation where one of them mentioned, hey, who do you think would be, just asking a group of students, who do you think would be good for president? And someone saying, hey, Jesse Jackson would be great. And it being completely dismissed by most of those CBC members who were there. They
and
were
about what time was this? Like around
this is months before he actually announced.
Okay.
So, not, it's while I was still in school. So, before graduation. So, maybe a year before.
Okay.
Or so. But it was relatively dismissed. What's he done? He runs his mouth, those kinds. But you have to remember that was the kind of talk from Black and white America about
It was
Jesse Jackson at that time. And then, really almost by accident, I got the job. Florence Tate was my best friend's mom. She's the mother, for those who don't know, also of Greg Tate, the author and writer, and the late Greg Tate. She had taken the job, and she had seen Brian and I start a business in her house. And I was the spokesperson for that business. And so she saw me work sort of in her kitchen and needed an assistant, and just sort of grabbed me and said, hey, you just graduated. I know you can do this. Come do this. And I was like, all right, who's this Jesse Jackson guy? And I just sort of thrust into that. And we were the first group of maybe 5 or 6 people to work in the DC office, which was the headquarters at the time. And it was just sort of history from there. And, after his death, the first folks who called were people from that era of the campaign, people who are friends, for life because of that. Just a very small group of people. And then it expanded after that.
So in those early days, you've graduated from Howard, you're figuring out your life, and you are supporting a Black man running for president, and it's real. It's not, it's not fringe. Did it feel real?
We actually adopted a phrase for a good first half of the campaign, that it's not a campaign, it's a movement. Or we said it's not a campaign, it's a revolution, or it's, these kinds of things, because people didn't take it seriously as a campaign. And to some degree, maybe we did, but we saw ourselves maybe as something different, that the approach was different. Most of us were learning on the job. Eventually pulled in people who had mostly local and state campaign experience. Our campaign manager, Arnold Pinckney, came from Ohio and had serious campaign experience, but he was, one of the few who had that. We were kind of making it up as we went along. The press certainly did not consider it as a serious campaign. And as a matter of fact, a lot of that generation of, very well-known Black journalists got their first shot at covering presidential campaigns because they were assigned to the Jesse Jackson campaign, precisely because their editors did not believe that it was a serious campaign. It's like,
they're like, here, go do this.
Here, go do this. It's a joke. It'll be over in a couple of weeks. You can go on a plane, get that experience, but it'll be over soon. When it became serious, it became the choice job to have. And some of those folks began to disappear off. They were questioned first by their editors. Are you being objective? How can you be objective about a Black candidate? Are you really writing the details? Why are you writing these puff pieces? Why does everything seem like it's great? There has to be something wrong. And then you saw a shift to them moving off, or you saw a shift to writers who were there specifically to prove something to their editors. I'm going to find the dirt. I'm going to find something wrong, specifically so I can prove to my editors that I'm objective. So there was that whole dynamic as well.
As you were saying, at first they didn't take him seriously. Once candidates are taken seriously and they start digging for things, you can always find something. Like, people aren't perfect. There's always something there's a fumble. There's something that gets said or done. And depending upon how big the candidate gets, that can be blown up. I mean, that happens all the time, doesn't it?
Sure.
And
But not much again, I mean, I think after that, I mean, there was there were the back and forth. People talk about him getting Lieutenant Goodman from Syria, as this, it's an amazing story, an amazing achievement. There were folks who were naysayers, about that, whether, an individual should be conducting foreign policy, there were folks, but, his moral standing, the fact that he was doing things that were right, however controversial, I put in quotes, they may have been, always, stood above whatever the controversy was. And that was part of his skill, I think.
Yeah. Hey guys, this is Dream Leapers with Harriette Cole. We're talking to Eric Easter and just thinking about Reverend Jackson and sharing stories about his life and all that he did. He spent some good time on this earth doing good things for folks. Mm-hmm. I think of him because they're showing a lot of footage of him being that statesman, the mm-hmm. international statesman. I remember even at the time, Eric, he's going to this country and rescuing people from political prisoners. And there were people who were fire-breathing mad that this Black man is doing this. Why is he the one doing it? And I remember very well that many people were astonished that he was able to pull this off when, they really were people who were political prisoners. And then he would come home. He came home with people. Why do you think that even could happen, given all that we know?
You're astonished until you went with him to another country. And there would be a essentially presidential motorcade to pick him up. And the presidents of those countries, entertained him in the way that they would another, a world leader, which in their mind he was. And so I think we often don't understand. And what's the analogy? A prince is never, seen as royal in their own country, whatever the line is, that kind of thing. To them, he was, today a letter came from King Charles, in the royal family, acknowledging his passing. Throughout Africa, throughout Europe, South America, he's regarded as a peer. And so walking in those rooms, again, moral authority. People understood and respected the Black struggle in America. The same way that they appreciated jazz and other, Black contributions to society. And as a representative of that, and as the then sort of the symbol of that, and the sort of living, breathing image of the best of that during those times, that gained him access to those places, and they were willing to talk, and he was willing to talk, and where the nation had, even when the country had taken a policy against talking to certain people, but they wanted to open a door, but had maybe taken a public stance against talking to folks, that he was often called on to make that connection. And sort of and to put in perspective, I even traveling with him, like you could look at the schedule and like, why are we going here? Why are we going there? We're here, we're there, or whatever. It seems strange. And certainly to outsiders, I got that a lot. Like, man, he's here. I saw him in the news. He's in this city, this day, next day he's this city. And it seems a little, it seemed like camera chasing to people. And that was a lot of the criticism. But, you have to mind, these are largely 90% of the time, except like during the campaign times where we were asked to go certain places. 90% of the time, these were, labor union that could not get attention, about their plight, trying to fight for fair pay. It was the grape workers and Cesar Chavez not being able to get attention for, the strike that was happening, or grocery workers who were fighting Ralph's Supermarket at the time, or chicken pluckers in South Carolina who can go get attention, farmers in Iowa, folks who needed their stories told and had reached a point where, hey, we've reached the limit of what we can do. We need someone like you to bring light on this subject, to bring light and heat on this subject. And then we can kind of take it afterwards and do our own thing. But without that light and that heat that you bring by your platform, no one will ever know this story. And when he could, he made the attempt to be there and to take the press there. This is a more important thing, to show it. And the thing I always say about him is that he's a master storyteller. And above all, not just the oration, but in understanding, sort of like Bobby Kennedy did, and Dr. King did, I'm going to take you to where this is happening. I need to let you see that. And then I'm going to, translate and interpret that for you. Mm-hmm. This is what's happening to our people. You need to be in this place. I'm going to take you to, Tunica, Mississippi, where there's still, where there's no running water, at the time. It's a casino now, but, to take you there. You're going to see it. I'm going to march through it. We're going to walk through this, and I'm going to interpret this for you. The thing about the '84 campaign in particular, he became cultural interpreter in many ways, as we all did as staff members, because you had press from Japan. Well, first you had white American press, but you had folks from Japan, from China, all these global who had never really experienced Black people. Right. Certainly not been in a Black church, right? Certainly who didn't understand that, Jet gets the interview before the New York Times, right? if we're in Georgia, right? Certainly who did not understand Black radio and the power of Black radio, and during that time when we could call the DJ and go on, or call the director, or call the owner and be on 3 stations and before all this syndication stuff. And so, you had to interpret, hey, yes, we're getting fried chicken on the plane every day because the church ladies are bringing us plates, to the airport. And so it was a lot of cultural interpretation as well as political interpretation. I'm going to see it and show it because the press had to go and then try to define the narrative afterwards.
And so what was that like? Because this is all like new information. It's almost like a new language because it's a new culture for them. If they're not of the culture, how?
So it was a harder job. It was a harder job for the press staff. It was a harder job for everyone. Everyone, like I said, became, there's going to the event, and then there's the conversation you got to have with the press people, like after you leave, to make sense. That's where the Black press, made, or Black reporters for the mainstream press made such a difference. They became the folks who could, and that's how they sort of held on to those positions when they were threatened with, being kicked off the plane, because they understood what was going on. So they understood, for example, when the Nation of Islam, in Chicago went to register the vote, they understood that had never happened before in the history of the Nation of Islam. They understood when the Nation of Islam was providing security before we were given Secret Service. They could interpret that. A lot of the white reporters and producers couldn't. I'm not, making it a racial thing. Just culturally, they just
culturally. I mean, not even all Black people know what that knew what that was at the time, but certainly it was foreign to others.
Right. And so that was part of Reverend Jackson's, gift as well, is not only exposing, but reshaping the narrative of Black culture, because he was taking folks into these spaces that they couldn't see. The thing that's left, I kept thinking about yesterday was road work. When people in the office, whether it was the campaigns or the Rainbow, would start bickering with one another and start battling for position, and you got this title, I got that other kind of thing. Mm-hmm. he would essentially put them on the road. And his way of dealing with that is like, you need to go be in the field for a couple of weeks. You need to see what you're working for. You need to see who you're working for, and remind yourself why you're here. You know, I mean, and it's, that's sort of how I try to, that's one of the sort of enduring lessons that I, took from that. I don't know, some of us are lucky enough, we go to the grocery store, something we don't think about. You go to the grocery store, you buy a bag of groceries, you're shocked when the price comes up after you bought it, but you got to the counter without counting and you were shocked by the number. And you forget that there are folks who, like, you got $20 and that $20, it needs to hit that $20 or you got to put something back. Right. I mean, I don't even know at what point that changed in my life, because I remember that point in my life very well. But that's the thing, is you don't need it but a couple of weeks of comfort and 3 meals to forget, how folks really live and how folks are doing, particularly in this country, because you step into another country and you realize that even those who are struggling in this country are doing better than folks in other places. So you have to remind yourself of where the pain really is. That's what he did with his travels. That's what he showed to the press. That's what he made the staff learn, and that's what drove him, I think, until his death, being concerned about that.
It's interesting. The two sides of what you just described that occur to me. One, he did get a lot of criticism for always being on TV, like that he's, media grabber, right? But what you just described, the stories that he was bringing to life because he was there.
Right.
Back then, do you feel like people's eyes were opening when they saw these are real issues in America, that the farmers and this one and that, all the different places where he went? What happened to the consciousness of the country?
I think so. I'd say the first example of people seeing it was the Rainbow Coalition itself, was the people in the campaign. It amazes me, really prior to the campaign, I had Black friends and I had maybe like one white friend, a couple people from high school that I don't talk to anymore. But it changed to like this global collective of folks from every race, every creed, every belief. That was the organization that he put together, and it just sort of extended out into the constituencies that those staff people represented. I mean, he was able to find the common ground between those two and say, hey, listen, if we can agree on these three things, we can work for these three things. There may be 10 other things that we don't, we're not quite there yet, but if we can work together on these three things, we can change some things. And I think the votes showed that he started that, and then he increased it. It began in 84 and 88. You saw the message starting to turn into real votes and to close to a victory. Certainly winning the South, which was certainly unexpected. So I think people saw. At what point people lost that, I think I think the divisions between us have been exploited, since then.
But this sense of his use of language, and first of all, his vision, but then his articulation of the vision, because language is so important. The poetry that probably also came through the church, but there are people who don't know that Keep Hope Alive was his. I've talked to some young people. We just know it. We know it because he said it all the time. But he had, so as you say, Rainbow Coalition, that's what he called this group that he assembled. But the vision for that this man who was with Dr. King when he was assassinated, who marched, who was there on the front lines as a young man, to have this vision that actually people from all walks of life could come together and work toward a cause. And then he made it happen.
Right.
That's a huge vision.
Yeah. And so the thing that the other vision that doesn't get spoken about, you hear, I hear this a lot with younger people who criticize, his generation of civil rights leaders and Dr. King and say that they, you know, they sort of dropped the ball on the economic point of it. You hear that a lot. And I say, you know, what don't you know about Jesse Jackson? You know, that he did that. I mean, he more than anyone took that. I mean, the family did a press conference today, and Jonathan, Jackson said it. You know, if you can go to a McDonald's, and the burger patties are being made by a black supplier, or you go to Home Depot and you've got 20, or a couple of hundred black suppliers. You've got, you go to the hotel and the napkins are being provided by a black supplier, or the government contracts, folks, 8A firms. Those are all doors, opened largely by Jesse Jackson, and there are people who relied on him to open those doors, and then those who hated Reverend Jackson for opening the door, then said, "Well, but I'll deal with you and give you this contract. I can't stand him. Just keep him away from me. I'll do this business from you." And so so that visibility of being everywhere was the platform to be able to the next day go in and do the work. So people were threatened by the audience he could bring, threatened by the attention he could bring, or intimidated by the attention he could bring, and by the votes he could bring. And so, they would consider themselves maybe being browbeat or maybe being bullied or whatever but they did it, and they wound up working with folks who endured, who were great businesses, and who they have, decades of relationships with, not because they're black, because the folks were good, and so he laid that economic foundation. Marion Barry did it on a local level in DC, but I think there's a whole class, really the story untold, there's a whole class of middle and upper class black folks in business and media on Wall Street and whatever, who are a direct and indirect relationship to Reverend Jackson's work on that front. And so that was part of the vision and the genius, whatever. And all the other. Let me
just let folks know, this is Dream Leapers with Harriette Cole. We're going all in with Eric Easter, talking about remembering Reverend Jesse Jackson. And I love these stories. Eric was with him for a number of years and is giving us his insights. I just want to ask you, this economic piece, because if we look at history, what I recall was when Dr. King started talking about the economy, that was when he got assassinated. Before, the other stuff was important, but when he started talking about money and wanting us to really have a fair wage and all of that, he was soon after assassinated. Jesse Jackson took that baton much further. As you just described, the seeds that were planted now, today, even with all the anti-DEI, which is crippling, still there are vendors at all of these different places many of whom still have contracts. The Wall Street project was a really important project as well, wasn't? Can you describe that?
After my time there, but it was an extension of Operation Push and what it was doing with other businesses. It was just sort of the next level of the next door that needed to be torn down. And so I do remember making a number of visits to the one or two black firms that were around at the time, who were looking for more access, looking for more capital. He brought folks together to make sure that they knew one another, that they did business with one another, and to make sure that both black folks and women had seats at the table in these Wall Street businesses, and it was one of the hugely successful projects, again unheralded, but hugely successful, creating a body of wealth that that we never really had access to before.
What people said, and you alluded to this, he was often described as a shakedown artist in one way or another. Oh, he's going in and shaking the trees and they're giving him money. The behind the scenes of it that we see now, because that was some years ago, that we see now, these seeds were planted. And maybe it was, shaking the trees. but shouldn't the relationships have been more equitable anyway? What did it feel like during your time, you know, for him to get those doors to open and get people to listen to? Because, you know, it's not like folks said, "Oh, of course, I want to help you."
You know, it's hard to describe. I mean, it's kind of overwhelming, you know, when you're moving at that pace. And just to give folks, I mean, I did a piece on Substack the other day with listing like a schedule, just a 2-month schedule. I mean,
Right, I remember it, yeah.
You know, 2 or 3 cities a day, meeting after meeting, event after event, just sort of breaking down doors, you know, bit by bit by bit by bit by bit. So you didn't really see it, you know, or when you did, it happened so fast, you were on to the next thing. And so it took, you know, years really after leaving to really still processing. You know, it's just so overwhelming. I mean, I look at those schedules, and I didn't keep a journal. You know,
you didn't have time.
Didn't have time, but I can look at those schedules and remember every moment of every event once I see the schedules, and it's just so much, so much that it was hard to understand at the time. You know, so, you know, the funny thing, you know, even the speeches, you know, this beautiful oratory, a lot of the speeches were given every day, right? Somewhere every day. And so, you know, your staff, you know, one of the things, you know, on the road is like, all right, he hit this line, you know, if my people who are humbled by their name, you know, will called by their name, will humble themselves and pray. When he got to that line, you knew, all right, I got 5 minutes. Right. And so, you know, you're just running around, you're thinking about the next event. You got to get to the plane. You got to get everybody together. You know, you got to get out of the way of the Secret Service. You hear that. And like, so you're hearing this like wonderful oratory, but like you heard it like twice yesterday and then the day before.
So he was actually repeating speeches.
Well, yeah, would always add a little bit, but, you know, his argument is like, you heard it. It's new to these folks. Like, you know, I said in Mississippi today, but the day I'm in Iowa, the day I'm in Indiana, it's a different crowd, different audience. They need to hear, you know, 90% of it would be, it's a stump speech. I mean, that's the definition of a stump speech.
Exactly, yeah.
But I'm just saying, from the perspective of somebody who's hearing it every day, you know, you could get used to it. You could, you know, get immune to it after a while. And then, you know, he'd get the feeling one time and turn into, you know, the country preacher. And then you know, there are churches that I remember were like, oh my God, like I can't believe I work for this guy. And it's just blow you away. And you just realize who you're dealing with. He was just an amazing energy and amazing presence, an amazing spiritual leader. And I think that's probably not spoken of enough. Yes, he was Reverend Jackson, but people don't talk about the, you know, because of the civil rights, people forget about the faith part of it. And the fact that he was, you know, a divinity student and who understood the word. I mean, and you know, the Gospels always align in there. You know, at best, you know, if you wrote for him, if you're lucky enough to write some things, you know, you're lucky enough to get a line or two in, or maybe do a draft. But, you know, he wrote it mostly himself by hand. Wow. And maybe would put a bullet point or two that you could include or would suggest. But there was always a part of the Bible in it. There was always, you know, a handwritten, you know, and not the words, by the way. He would just write like, you know, the scripture, you know, Ephesians, you know, that would just be his notes.
So the marker, so that he would know.
Yeah, bullet points. I'm going to hit these points. You know, never sort of written out. I'm gonna hit these points, and like on this point, I'm gonna hit, you know, Ephesians, and it would just be that, you know, the name of the book or the,
because he really was a preacher, and
he was a preacher, and like he didn't have to, like, of course he didn't write that down. I mean,
he didn't hold the Bible upside down.
No, he didn't hold the Bible upside down, and you know. So
but let me ask you, but even regarding that, because while he was a preacher, while he knew the Bible, somehow, as I recall it, he would say these things, but it didn't, if you weren't Christian, you still felt included. There was a way that he was able to include everyone, even though he was rooted in Christianity. How do you think he was able to do that? What did you observe?
Well, I mean, if you believe in the faith in the way he did, the faith includes everyone. You know, I
Sure.
mean, the Bible included everyone.
Right.
So if you come from that belief, I mean, he studied Howard Thurman and he studied, you know,
Right.
the great theologians, and that was their philosophy. So
Yep.
he simply took that and ran with it. And politics was not outside of that as well. It was a part of that. It was the action that came with the faith. So, you know, he simply acted out what his belief system was.
Mm-hmm.
And those of his mentors and the folks he studied with and trained with. And, you know, he was very much a student, really, of everything. I mean, just the smartest person I ever met.
Wow.
And, you know, very difficult boss to work for, I might add, because of
Why?
that. Well, so, you know, it's hard. Like I came in as a, you know, first year out of college. Kind of crazy to come to work with someone who, you know, 20, 25 years older than you, who outworks you. You know, I mean, just to see that, you know, got up earlier, went to bed later, always outflanked you, you know, was better at your job than you could ever be, whatever your job was in the campaign. So just hard to work for. So not a, you know, a tough taskmaster because of that, because you always wanted to be better than you were, to be like half as good as he was as these things. And, you know, like a lot of times you just couldn't get there, you know.
What were your years working for him?
The 84 campaign, the 88 campaign, and then from August of 88 through about May of 1990, I traveled with him every day.
So where does Mandela fit into that?
Mandela was February of 1990.
Can you tell us that story?
All right, what can I tell this? You know, we had been, you know, Reverend Jackson, for those who don't know, was very much a part of, and when, you know, I think maybe, you know, when you and I were in college, the anti-apartheid movement was very much a part of what we did, what we worked on as students. It was sort of the major protest divestiture from South Africa. And then a good part of what, you know, he and Walter Fauntroy and Eleanor Holmes Norton, a lot of what they did was to get arrested in front of the South African embassy in protest. And so his visa had been canceled at one point because of his protests against South Africa. They at some point allowed him to go back in, but part of the South African government, by the way, allowed him to come back in, maybe about a month or two when they, you know, opened up the visa to him. They allowed him to come back in, but with a restriction that, you know, if you come back in, we're not gonna, you know, you can't say these things, you can't say those things. They attempted to sort of shut it down. That was the attempt. Prior to going to South Africa, we actually went to the Soviet Union. We went to London and participated in an anti-apartheid rally. When we traveled to Africa, we often saw exiles from the ANC and spent time with those folks in Zimbabwe and Zambia and in London. And when we, so on that trip after London, you know, we went to South Africa, but because he participated in that London event, an anti-apartheid rally, it was seen as, you know, perhaps a violation of whatever restriction they were trying to put on him when we got to South Africa. So when we landed, and there were a lot of folks with us. I mean, there was Reverend H. Beecher Hicks, there was Jesse Jackson Jr., there was Reverend Willie Barrow, there was oh God, the first Black member of Parliament in Britain, Bernie. Oh, It'll come to. I'm sorry. It'll get to me.
I'm amazed that you remember all this. So keep going.
Well, there were writers, John Edgar Wideman, Sylvester Monroe from Newsweek. Interesting crowd of folks. And when we got there, though, the press sort of laid in wait for us. The press that had been that was working with the apartheid government just sort of demeaned the trip and everybody on the staff. I remember the title. It said Jesse's Flying Circus. That was the headline of the
Sounds scarily familiar to.
It was one of the newspapers. It was out, but others were supportive. And so we tour. I actually was asked to work personally with the ANC while I was there to help do press for that trip and for other things. But while we were there, unbeknownst to us prior to it, there was some sense that Mandela would release. And so here's something to know where a lot of people don't know. Mandela had already been released about a month before he walked out. And I think maybe there's a documentary or film that shows that he had been released, but was in seclusion. It was sort of a transition period and still negotiating with de Klerk and those folks. We met as well. So we met with de Klerk and Botha. And then
before he walked,
days before, we visited some townships. We went to see Winnie Mandela. Something happened on that trip. We didn't quite do that. Visited Soweto. Went through Joburg, and when we're in Cape Town, we got word that Nelson Mandela was going to be released, and from Robben Island. And so it basically went back to symbolically walk out.
Got it. And hold on, let me tell folks. Literally, we have 5 minutes left. Can you believe this? We don't want it to end. We don't want it to end. This is Dream Leapers with Harriette Cole. We're talking to Eric Houston, going down memory lane about Reverend Jesse Jackson. Okay, literally, we have 5 minutes, but we want to hear the rest of the story.
So, well, it's longer than 5 minutes, but quickly, he we found out he would get out. A lot of the public was told that it would be in a different location, that he would get out, but he would speak at the Seven Steps. For those who know Cape Town, the Seven Steps is a historic location where the community of Cape Colors was sort of kicked out at one point. It's sort of what's left of that community that was bulldozed at one point. And sort of falsely telling folks that he would be there when he would actually, because that's where folks were rushing to. We were able to find out he was actually going to be at City Hall to speak. Reverend Jackson went to meet him as he walked out. The rest of us went to City Hall and were sort of wound our way up in there. And prior to speaking, Mr. Mandela came in just before he spoke, came in to speak to us. There were maybe about 50 people in the room. Bishop Tutu, leaders of the ANC, other folks who had been imprisoned and were released. And we had sort of a private audience with him, and we all, it was like an aura came up, and it was like an angel had walked in the room, and everybody just sort of sat at his feet, including Reverend Jackson, and just, it's like, we're not worthy, and it was, it's a crazy story, and it's one of those things that nobody ever believes. But we were able to sit with him, talk with him, and have him talk about the power of the moment. And then he went down to speak with all of those, thousands of people in the press, at the in front of the City Hall. And we spent the whole time passing down water to folks. People had climbed up on the side of the building and were thirsty, and people were fainting and all that, and we just sort of passed out water down to folks in the audience. And it was, probably the most amazing thing in my life, certainly the most eventful moment of my life. Probably my decision to leave and move on, not because I, at that point I said, I have to do something that is meaningful to me, that is sort of my own. And I think everybody who were, leaving with this, I think, a lot of people sort of came through, some folks stayed with Reverend Jackson for many, many years, many decades. Other folks, 2-3 years, burned out, but, because of such a schedule. But really, learning the lessons of what they needed to know to go out and do their own thing. I think he attracted folks who wanted to make their own mark on the world in some way. And when you saw the example of what he did every day, that was the challenge. It was sort of the unspoken challenge. I'm trying to, my private goal is to revisit all of those places I did with him in some way. I was able to do that in some way through the book I did, but, showing people what I saw.
So wait, let me just pause for a second and see, this is the cliffhanger, y'all. So, because I'm not going to stop talking to Eric, but depending upon how you're listening to this, you may not get the whole of it. So you can go to harrietcole.com and you'll get the whole thing, because we're going to keep talking, but I do have to end this episode. So for those of you who have to go, sorry, but you can hear the rest of it if you come to my website. Okay, Eric, I'd have to go back to Mandela. We can't, because there's some more to, I'm sure there's tons to unpack. But first of all, back to what you were saying about wherever Jesse Jackson went, he was treated as the leader. So the fact that he was in this room of just the few people with Tutu, et cetera, and that's first where Mandela came, that means so much.
It was an amazing moment. It did mean a lot. And the folks who were not happy about that as well. But yeah, I mean, it was important that journalists were in the room. I'll tell this story, and he is, I won't say who it is, even in his death, but there was one journalist, a Chicago journalist, who begged to be in that room and begged me to be the first journalist who to interview Mandela. I talked to the folks at the ANC. I arranged it. He was in the room, and he was just about to do it, put the microphone in his face, and he just fell out in tears because of the power of the moment. Didn't get the interview. He got it later when Mr. Mandela came to the United States, but the moment was too late. I clowned him about it for a long time, but I absolutely understood. But that was just the moment it was. I mean, people really, there was like a halo around him, and people just sort of sat there and heard him talk, and that was it. We were there for another week or so as things unfolded, just to sort of watch the world change in South Africa in that week. I do remember going into a store, and people were very friendly to us. It was apartheid still going on, but we weren't South African Black folk, right? Different thing. So people were very kind, and someone, white store owner asking, like, so when are they coming to get us? Essentially, like when's the apocalypse? Essentially,
right?
And that was the prevailing feeling. Like, we have been so terrible to them, now that they're about to take over. What are they going to do to us? And obviously, that's not what happened. And so that's a whole story and psychology in itself. But that's that was sort of the tone of that week. And we had a couple more audiences with Mr. Mandela and with the ANC, and then went back. And again, life-changing moment.
So I know that you were so busy through all of these things, but what's happening inside of you that you were in the company of Mr. Mandela? You're in the company of all of these people, these different world leaders, him probably being at the top of that list, as you describe him having a halo around him. You were exposed to the world through Jesse Jackson. What, if you can even quantify it, like what is that impact on you?
Exposure. He said to me once, just sort of called me uh, aside on the airplane and ask, what's the greatest gift you can give to someone? And I didn't know. He said exposure. And and that I think was the first day I traveled with him. And he said, you will see, things that you can't imagine, and like if you're willing to, put in the work, it'll open, your mind and open doors for you. I was like, okay, but but impossible to sort of, again, still processing it, because it moved at such a fast pace. But there were moments, and again, I want to put this, it was his room, right? So yes, I was allowed to be in rooms, and as my colleagues were, but clear, you were there because he let you be, not because it was something you did. Certainly, sure. Maybe you did something to get the job, but you didn't create the room. You're allowed to be there, and it was a gift. So you just saw it as a gift. So many stories, and I talked to a friend who worked at a different time. There's networks of folks who worked for him in different periods. Mm-hmm. We didn't know each other while we were working, but we've become, friends and, colleagues over, over our mutual experience, our shared experience. And I was talking to someone else, and it's like, you see these things that you can never tell anybody about. The main reason, because nobody will ever believe them. Like, right. You maybe tell your family, but nobody else believes it. So at a point, you just stop telling it, and you get with the other folks who had the experience, and you share stories with them. But nobody else will believe it, and which is why you don't see like a ton of books,
right?
You don't see a bunch of memoirs. The articles are very broad, because one, it feels very personal. Another reason, it's very difficult to process, and at some levels, not your story to tell. Yes, I was in the room with Margaret Thatcher and like all these folks. Wasn't my story to tell, though. Like, I wasn't there because of me. I met her. She was nice. I have no more story. I have no more story other than that. I've been in 10 Downing Street. That's the end of my part of that. The rest was him and what he was able to achieve in those spaces. And so that's what you write on. And you just feel blessed to have been a part of a moment. But it's like, what do you do with that again? And so, my mission was storytelling, right? Mm-hmm. That's where I came from. I was a filmmaker, writer, journalist before getting the job. So I was trained to do. And so, I saw my role as, again, I want other people to see what I've experienced. Mm-hmm. The fact that one particular day, we went from, Dr. King's Church. We came from Abyssinian in New York to Dr. King's Church in Atlanta to a farm in Southern California. To
one day.
This is one day, like cross. This is very odd. Very usual actually to go across several time zones. You start in one time zone, you end start on the East Coast, start on the West Coast, so you can maximize the day. But ending at in Bill Cosby's Rolls Royce limo, getting a ride, who had sent his limo to pick us up to take us to our hotel, and like it's like in that same day you saw like crashing poverty, and you saw the Black church, and you saw like this, undiscoverable wealth of, but all Black people along the way, and that exposure, that you can be in a room with a president of the country if you have the talent to be. That was the lesson. Mm-hmm. Two, some of those people are not as smart as you think they are. That was another thing. And which is not a knock against them, but equal education, equal grounding. A bit of luck, right place, right time, whatever. Work certainly, but if you do that, you can be that as well. Which it was just a revolutionary concept for somebody who grew up, I was born in the projects of Baltimore. I mean, where I live in Baltimore. It doesn't matter where I live. I was from Baltimore. So that was, so that, just an explosion of, of concepts, around like what you can be, what you can do. I never said no to myself after that, about, can I do a book? Sure. Can I do a film? Sure. Whatever. If I do the work, yeah. That was, and so I've never lost that. That's what I instilled in my children. Not sure. I think I probably would have been a good dad like before that. I think I'm certainly a better father because of my experience with Jesse.
I was going to ask you, what lessons do you feel you've shared from Reverend Jackson with your 3 children?
Well, so the real blessing, the first calls I got about his death were from my kids who remembered him from when we lived in Chicago in their early years when, my son was 5, my sons were 5, 4, my daughter was, 1 or 2, but they still remember, we spent several holidays with his family. I'm still friends with, his children. And so, Halloween, they just remember, costumes and Reverend Jackson, my oldest son was talking about Reverend Jackson sleeping and snoring while but he was watching Cheetah Girls with, with him and the grandkids. And that's his memory, of watching cartoons with just being a dad, just, hanging out with the kids, enjoying his home, enjoying his family.
That's beautiful.
It is beautiful. And, it's taken years for them to process, oh, that's who that was.
Because that was just your friend.
Right. And so, I'm blessed that they had that experience. But, I saw him as a father as well, and how he, trained his family for greatness. The press conference that happened today was so very impressive and so very indicative of what he prepared his children for. If God forbid he wasn't going to be around, and they are so very prepared for this, whatever the next moment is, and that's what's important. I mean, I saw love. I saw, I didn't grow up with my father, so he was, for a lot of us on the team, and a lot of us had that story who worked with him, and he was very much kind of a surrogate father, and we were able to see it modeled. Whenever we were, blessed to be in the house. A lot of times his house was the jumping off point for the next trip. You'd meet him in the morning at his house, go Operation Push, whatever. So we got to see the family dynamic, or the family traveled with us, part of the family, at sometimes, usually someone always from the family. And just, to be able to bring your kid along, to a meeting with, this president or that world leader. I did the same when I wasn't meeting world leaders, but I did the same thing when I had kids. They went everywhere with me. That was right. I don't, whatever adults my kids are going. I'm going to the museum. We're going wherever I go. You're going to be exposed to everybody and everything.
Exposure. Yeah.
And you may not know that you may not being taught a lesson in real time in the real way do you think, but you're going to carry that experience with you. In how you relate to adults and how you relate to people and how you access opportunity.
Yeah. The last thing I want you to talk about, you had begun, but Songs of My People. Sure. That was such an important project, and tell us about it. And isn't there something else happening with it? Maybe.
Maybe. I mean, the spark of that again was what I saw. I was trying to translate and process what I saw traveling with the Reverend, the Black churches, the Black folks in so many roles in life, division across class, across economics, across jobs and position and places. I wanted folks to experience that. It was initially thought of to be a film in my head. Too expensive. Everybody said no. I mentioned the idea to a photographer who introduced me to my longtime friend now, Dudley Brooks, who grew up in Baltimore. I didn't know him in Baltimore. Who was at the Washington Post at the time, and became, photo director at the Washington Post, who was working on a similar idea, who had gathered a bunch of, photographers who had been talking for years about, hey, we need to do, this master project. Didn't have the how to do it. What I had was the how to and the connections to be able to get it done, and to the creative ideas. He had the, sort of the muscle and manpower and the creative folks and the people who would get it done. And that was the spark of it. And then we brought in, yourself and, Michael Cheers and, a whole crew of folks, and, 50 of, folks who are, revered now, photographers, many who went on to do their own books, because this thing opened up a door and opened up the idea of Black photo books as valuable again, right? But it was really, the core of it was, I want folks to see their people in a serious way, portrayed by folks who understood them. Right? Which was,
for people who don't know it, it's this beautiful photo documentary of life in Black America that
1992 when it came out, right? So the exhibit that went to 60 or 70 countries, and a photo book, and so that led to starting magazines and doing other things.
Okay, we're gonna stop on that question, Eric.
I don't want to talk about it anymore. But
I hope people are enjoying this conversation as much as I am. I knew that I wanted to talk to you about this. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you for sharing so many beautiful memories, and also, the analysis that you always bring to stuff. It's this is a really important moment. This is now going to be after Jesse Jackson, what happens next for the world, and to remember him and honor him. That's what we're supposed to be doing right now. And I knew you would be the perfect person to talk to. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And thank you to all of you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed listening to Eric and his wonderful stories as much as I did. Until next time, have a great day and make it count.